Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Chapter 9, the first part of Chapter 9. And in this particular lecture, we're going to go over muscle anatomy. And so when we start talking about skeletal muscle, for particularly when it comes to movement, skeletal muscle, or what I'll be using for the abbreviation for this lecture is SKM, skeletal muscle, is a striated muscle that is controlled by the somatic nervous system, okay? And we know the somatic nervous system as being voluntary. So, with that being said, we know skeletal muscle, if it's been controlled by somatic movement, produces voluntary movement of the body parts in relation to itself. Okay? So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about skeletal muscle and how it affects movement in the human body. And today we're going to break down the anatomy of the skeletal muscle so we can get into understanding how the muscle works and it causes movement of the human body. And so what we have here in front of you is we have a little version, little kind of sketch of skeletal muscle. So let's say this is the bicep per se, okay? And so we know the bicep is on the upper portion of our arm, and we've got a couple of key components I want to point out. Here we have what's called the tendon. And the tendons attach the muscle to the bone, typically to the head. So let's say this is the head of the humerus. And these tendons are attached to the shoulder. Okay? And then here, this is the muscle itself. And so that's kind of a quick and easy overview. And so if we go and let's go ahead and take our muscle and let's go ahead and take a cross-sectional sketch of it. And so what we have here again is our skeletal muscle that we just mentioned. Here are our tendons. And so, and the covering of the muscle itself, it has like a little bit of a sheath. And we actually call that the epimysium or epimysium, however you want to pronounce it. And so let's say we took out our bicep and we did a transverse cut of the muscle to see what's kind of on the inside. And then underneath the epimysium, what we have is another sheath that kind of breaks down the other subcomponents of the muscle itself, right? And then here we have, blood vessels, nerves, and stuff to help keep the muscle functioning and, to help get this the somatic signals to the muscle to help with movement. And as you can see, we've got all these little subsections in here that are all covered by the epimysium. Covered by what we call the perimysium, sorry. There we go. And so let's go ahead and take out one of these little cross-sectional areas of the perimysium. So I'm going to take out this one right here. Okay. There we go. Let's clean that up a little bit. And so each one of these little subsections are called a myofiber. So the perimysium is the sheath of the myofibers itself. And then right underneath that here in the green this sheath for the myofiber itself is called the endomysium. Okay? And then with each of the myofibers, we get started into the smaller components of the muscle. And let's go ahead and further break this down a little bit more. And so when we look into the myofiber itself, again, that covering, what we just had in the last screen in itself, is called the endomysium. So the endomysium is the covering for the myofiber. Okay? And so when we look at the myofibers themselves within the muscle, they can be short, they can be long, they could be upwards to a couple microcentimeters to several centimeters in length. And when we talk about centimeters in length for cells, that can be very long for them. And because of this, the length of a lot of the skeletal muscle, they're what we call, they're multinucleated. Okay? And when we say the term multinucleated, this just means they have several nuclei found within the muscle fiber itself. And with this, the myofiber, or also known as the muscle fiber, and the other thing to point out with this too is the myofiber, also known as the muscle fiber, like I just said, is the cell of the muscle. Which is also termed myocyte. And so here we're getting into the basic cell of the muscle. And due to the length of the myocytes, this is why they can be multinucleated. Okay. And also in the past we talked about how the myocytes or the skeletal muscle cells have multiple mitochondria with them, both at the surface and in the cell, to produce ATP for muscular contractions. And this is because of the length and the multiple subunits that occur with the muscle itself. So, with this being said, let's go ahead and clear some of this up a little bit. Okay. We have, let's go back up here again. So again, we have the sheath of the myofiber, which is covered by the endomysium. Now, when we start looking at the basic structure of the myofiber itself, when we start looking at the interior of it, you have what's called the sarcolemma, right? And then within the sarcolemma, right, it breaks down the subcomponents of the myofibril, of the myofiber into the myofibril. So, let's go ahead and clean this up a little bit more. Let's use a different color. Let's go use yellow. Further pull this out. And again, the sarcolemma is covering the myofibril. Now, don't get this confused with myofiber, okay? The myofibril is a smaller component or a subcomponent of the myofiber itself. And within the myofibril, we have our myosin, our actin, all the components that are necessary for muscular contraction. And so when we start looking at, we're breaking out the myofibril a little bit more, and really at this component, we are getting into the down to molecular stage of the skeletal muscle cell itself. And then the myofibril is made of several subcomponents called the sarcomere. The sarcomere is the contractile component of the myofibril. Okay, and so you have series of these within the length of the myofibril itself. And these little squiggly lines on the sides here, right, are what we call the Z lines. And these are what give the striated components of skeletal muscle. And when we look in there, we've got all these little lines and stuff in here, which we'll break down in a minute. But this is what gives the sarcomere its shape and its color and texture. And now, when we start breaking down the sarcomere anatomy, we have several subcomponents in here. So, for example, we have the actin components within it, right? Oops. Go ahead and get rid of this. So what we first said here is, we said these were the Z lines, right? It's probably better if I actually used a different color here. Let me go ahead and back up here just really quickly. Let's go and make these green. And these are actin filaments, right? Also known as thin filaments. So your actin filaments are attached directly to the Z line itself, okay? And then when we start looking towards the center, you have the myosin chains, or the myosin heavy chains. And the myosin chains have the myosin heads attached to it. And here we're kind of showing it in a 3D form, but it occurs 3D all around the myosin head itself. So it can connect to the actin heads itself and cause muscular contractions. And when we get into the power stroke theory for muscular contraction, we'll go in a little more depth in this. But right now, let's just go into a basic view of myosin itself. Okay. And so these are our myosin. also known as thick filaments. And so the myosin itself is attached to the center line here as part of the sarcomere. And what we can do is we can break our sarcomere into a couple of different areas for identification. So when we start looking here at the Z line, we have this little area that contains just the actin itself. We call this the I band. And this, again, contains actin only. We have another subcomponent that we can break it down to is what we call the A band. Let's go ahead and use another color here. So this A band covers the entire length of the myosin. And now we have another subcomponent called the H band. And this is probably the most important that you need to remember. Because the H band, this is the only portion in the sarcomere that can change its distance due to contraction. So as a muscle contracts, the H band shortens. And this is assuming that this drawing is the muscle in its relaxed state. And so with this, this is kind of the basic muscle structure that I want you to kind of take home and understand. So what we've done with all of this today is we went from a top-down view of the muscle. We took a transverse cut, and looked at the epimysium, right? We looked at the epimysium, broke it down into the paramysium, which is which kind of breaks out and covers the myofibril itself. And the myofibril on its surface has what's called the endomysium. And that myofiber is the myofiber itself, again, is the muscle cell, right? If I can spell. And then that's further broken down into the myofibril, which contains our sarcomeres, right? Which are broken down and allows us to do contractions. So, if you can understand this, this will help with better understanding with muscular contractions when we get into the power stroke theory and the other components of muscle anatomy later on in this chapter. I hope this helps, and thank you for your time and patience. I'll see you on the next lecture.